There's a dog who sits at the corner of Maple and 7th Street. Every morning, same spot, same time, for 7 years. The townspeople have a name for him now, the waiting dog. But here's what they don't know yet. He's not waiting for someone who's coming back. He's waiting for someone who can't. And the woman who finally stops to ask why is waiting for something too. This is a story about what happens when two broken hearts recognize each other. If you drove past the old Victorian house on Maple Street in the autumn of 2016, you might have missed him entirely. A rust-colored dog, medium-sized, lying beneath the wrought iron fence with his chin resting on his paws. His eyes, amber, patient, impossibly sad, tracking every car that turned the corner. Most people did miss him until they didn't. Until one morning became every morning. Until autumn became winter, became spring, became 7 years. The mailman, Derek, was the first to notice the pattern. Day 63, he'd mutter, marking it in his mental calendar. Then day 112. Then he stopped counting because the numbers made his chest hurt. The dog never begged, never barked, never wandered. He simply waited. As if he'd made an appointment with destiny and refused to be late. By year 2, he'd become part of the landscape. The bakery owner, Mrs. Chen, started leaving day-old croissants wrapped in wax paper by the fence post. She never saw him eat them, but by dusk they were always gone. The school children named him Captain. They'd pet his graying muzzle on their way home, whispering secrets they wouldn't tell their parents. He'd listen with those ancient, knowing eyes, and somehow they felt heard. The teenagers joked he was waiting for a girl dog who'd ghosted him. The elderly folks knew better. They recognized that particular brand of loyalty, the kind that outlives reason. Someone hung a tattered blanket over the fence during the first snowstorm of year 3. Someone else left a water bowl that became permanent. By year 5, there was a makeshift shelter, wooden pallets, and a tarp that no one claimed responsibility for, but everyone protected. Has anyone tried to take him home? The newer residents would ask. Oh, they'd tried. Animal control came twice. He'd vanish into the overgrown bushes, only to reappear the next morning. The shelter sent their gentlest volunteer. The dog had pressed himself against the fence, trembling until she left. He'd chosen his post, and nothing, no storm, no summer heat that cracked the pavement, no well-meaning human, could convince him to abandon it. But here's what no one understood yet. He wasn't being stubborn. He was being faithful. And there's a difference that breaks your heart when you finally learn it. The dog, his name was Copper, though he'd almost forgotten the sound of it, lived inside a memory. Not the whole memory, just fragments. Sensory ghosts that played on loop. The click, click, click of a particular pair of shoes on the sidewalk. The creak of a porch step that needed fixing but never got fixed. The smell of lavender hand soap and coffee grounds. And a voice, soft, weathered, always a little amused, saying, "There's my boy, right on time as always." In the beginning, the memory had been sharp enough to cut. Every car that rounded the corner sent electricity through his limbs. Every footstep made his heart hammer against his ribs. This time, this time, this time, but time is cruel to hope. The edges of the memory had softened, blurred. Now he waited not because he believed, but because he didn't know how to do anything else. The waiting had become who he was. Copper had belonged to a woman named Eleanor Hartley. She'd found him at the shelter 12 years ago. A scrappy 6-month-old puppy with oversized paws and a habit of howling at the moon. The shelter workers warned her he was a lot of dog for a woman her age. Eleanor was 71 and had just buried her husband of 49 years. "Then it sounds like we both need someone who's a lot," she'd said, signing the adoption papers with a hand that barely shook. They became inseparable in that particular way that happens when two lonely creatures decide to save each other. Every morning at 7:15, they'd walk to the corner bakery. Eleanor would order a black coffee and a blueberry scone. Copper would sit patiently by the bench, and she'd sneak him pieces when she thought no one was looking. Everyone was always looking. Everyone loved watching them. "You're going to make him fat," Mrs. Chen would tease. "Then he'll have more of him to love," Eleanor would reply, scratching behind his ears in that exact spot that made his back leg kick involuntarily. They had routines, sacred, unbreakable routines. Evening walks at sunset, mystery novels read aloud on the porch, while Copper dozed at her feet, his head in her lap during thunderstorms because he never quite outgrew the puppy fear of lightning. She talked to him like he understood every word. Maybe he did. "You know what I love about you, Copper?" she'd say, her fingers combing through his fur. "You stay. Everyone I've ever loved has left. Not by choice, but they've left. And you stay." He'd always stay, he'd promised with his eyes. Always. September 14th, a Tuesday. Eleanor had seemed tired that morning, more than usual. She'd moved slowly down the porch steps, her hand gripping the railing tighter than normal. "Getting old is not for the faint of heart, my boy," she'd murmured. But they'd made their walk, coffee, scone, the bench. She'd been quieter than usual, kept touching his head, running her thumb over the white streak on his muzzle that made him look distinguished. She'd always said, "If something ever happened to me," she'd started, then stopped. "No, never mind. Bad luck to talk like that." But she'd held him closer, just a fraction longer. When they'd returned home, she'd gone inside to make lunch. Copper waited on the porch like always, dozing in the September sun. He'd woken to sirens, to neighbors gathering, to strangers in uniforms moving urgently through Eleanor's front door. And then, nothing. Hours of nothing. A niece he'd never met had come that evening, crying, making phone calls. She'd tried to coax Copper inside. "Come on, boy. You can't stay out here." But he could. He had to, because Eleanor would worry if she came back and he wasn't waiting. The niece came back the next morning with a leash. Copper had run, not far, just far enough. Into the bushes, behind the garage. He'd watched her search, call, plead. Finally, she'd left, and Copper had returned to the porch, to the exact spot where he'd last seen Eleanor walk through that door. Days passed, then weeks. The house changed. Strangers came and went, packing boxes, removing furniture. The porch swing where they'd sat together was loaded into a truck and driven away. But Copper remained, because in his understanding, in the simple, devastating logic of a dog's love, waiting was the only thing that made sense. She'd said he stayed, so he would stay. Even when the new owners changed the locks, even when the porch was repainted and the garden ripped out, even when every trace of Eleanor was erased, except for the memory of her voice. "There's my boy, right on time." So Copper waited, right on time, every single day, for someone who would never turn that corner again. The first winter nearly killed him. December brought ice storms that turned the street into a frozen wasteland. Copper's paws cracked and bled. His ribs began to show through his matted coat. But the town, quietly, almost secretly, kept him alive. The teenage boy from 3 houses down started bringing leftover meatloaf in Tupperware containers. He'd set them down without a word, hands shoved in his pockets, embarrassed by his own kindness. The veterinarian, Dr. Patel, did a drive-by check every few weeks, leaving antibiotics hidden in hot dogs when Copper developed an ear infection. "I'm not saying I approve of this," Dr. Patel told Mrs. Chen, "but I'm also not going to let him suffer." No one could explain why they protected him instead of forcing rescue. Maybe because his waiting felt holy somehow, like bearing witness to it was a privilege. The Hendersons moved in next door with their 2 young daughters. 8-year-old Sophie fell in love immediately. "Can we keep him, Mommy? Please? He doesn't have anyone." Her mother, Sarah, tried. God, she tried. She brought a dog bed to the fence. Copper sniffed it and walked away. She sat beside him every afternoon for 2 weeks, speaking softly, offering treats. He'd accept the food with dignity, never excitement, then return his gaze to the street. "What are you waiting for, buddy?" Sarah whispered one evening. As if in answer, Copper's ears had perked up at the sound of a passing car, an older sedan similar to the one Eleanor had driven. He'd stood, body trembling with sudden electricity. The car passed. Copper sank back down, and Sarah's heart shattered. "You're waiting for someone who's gone, aren't you?" Sophie cried when her mother explained they couldn't force Copper to leave his post. "But he's so sad, Mommy." "I know, baby, but some kinds of love are bigger than happiness." By year 5, Copper had become legend. A journalist from the local paper did a feature. "The Dog Who Never Stops Hoping," the headline read. The article went viral, briefly. Strangers drove from neighboring towns to take photos. Copper tolerated them with weary patience. Donations poured into the animal shelter in his name. A local artist painted his portrait. Someone started a social media account tracking his daily presence. Copper waits trending for a weekend. But trends fade, and Copper remained. His muzzle had gone fully white now. His movements carried the stiffness of arthritis. He'd developed a cloudy cataract in his left eye. The town's children, who'd been in elementary school when he'd first appeared, were now in high school. They'd stop by to tell him about college applications, heartbreaks, victories, confessions they couldn't tell anyone else. He'd become the keeper of their secrets, the witness to their growing up. And still he waited. By the 7th autumn, something had changed. Copper no longer jumped to his feet at every sound. He barely lifted his head. His body had grown gaunt despite the food left daily. He was giving up, not on waiting. He'd never give up on that, but on living. Mrs. Chen started crying when she saw him on a particularly cold October morning. "He's dying," she told her husband. "He's decided to die there." The town held its breath. Derek the mailman started leaving handwritten notes at the shelter. Someone needs to do something. But what? Force a dying dog away from the only thing giving his life meaning? The shelter director visited personally. "Copper," she'd said gently, kneeling by the fence. "It's okay to let go. Wherever she is, she'd want you to be happy." Copper had looked at her with those amber eyes, dimmer now, but still heartbreakingly faithful. And the shelter director understood. He couldn't let go. This vigil was his purpose, his promise, his last act of love. To abandon it would be to betray everything he was. Margaret Chen, no relation to the bakery owner, though everyone assumed, moved into the old Victorian house on Maple Street in late October. She was 56, recently divorced, 2 grown children who called dutifully every Sunday, but had their own lives now. She'd bought the house because it was beautiful and haunted, and far away from the life she'd spent 30 years building that had collapsed in a single lawyer's office. She'd noticed the dog on her second day. "Who does he belong to?" she'd asked her realtor. "Himself, I guess. It's a long story." That night, Margaret Googled "dog waiting Maple Street." She'd read the articles, watched the old news clips, scrolled through years of social media posts, and then she'd done something she hadn't done since the divorce. She'd cried, not gentle tears, racking, gasping sobs that bent her double, because she understood she'd been waiting too. Waiting for her husband to come back from wherever he'd gone emotional years before he'd finally left. Waiting for her children to need her again. Waiting for her life to feel like it meant something. She'd been sitting in her own invisible corner, watching the world pass, unable to move forward. Margaret started simply. She'd sit on her porch with her morning coffee, 50 feet from where Copper lay. She didn't speak, didn't approach, just existed nearby, day after day. On the 4th morning, Copper's ear flicked in her direction. On the 8th, he turned his head slightly. On the 12th, when she stood to go inside, he watched her leave. Progress. She began narrating her day aloud, not to him specifically, just speaking into the space between them. "I'm thinking about painting the kitchen cabinets. My daughter says I should do navy blue, but I'm worried it'll feel too dark. What do you think?" Copper's tail moved, just once, a tiny, involuntary twitch. Margaret's breath caught. "Navy it is," she whispered. She started bringing her lunch outside. Sitting on the porch steps, casually tossing pieces of chicken toward him, not close enough to threaten, just available. He'd wait until she went inside to eat them. Then one afternoon, 3 weeks in, he ate while she watched. And Margaret understood. He'd granted her permission to witness him. November brought early snow. Margaret woke at 2 a.m. to the sound of wind howling, and her first thought was, Copper. She'd pulled on boots and a coat and gone outside with a flashlight. He was curled tight against the fence, shivering violently. "Oh, sweetheart," she'd breathed. She'd gone inside, grabbed every blanket she owned, and built a shelter against the fence, a proper one, with plastic sheeting and thermal blankets, and a waterproof tarp. Copper had watched her work, head tilted. When she'd finished, she'd crawled partway into the shelter herself, making it safe, warm. "Come on," she'd said softly. "Just for tonight. I promise you can still see the street." He hadn't moved. She'd sat in the snow beside the shelter entrance. "I know you made a promise," she said quietly. "I know you can't break it. But here's the thing about promises, Copper." She'd learned his name from Mrs. Chen. "The people we make them to, they'd want us to survive them. They'd want us to be okay." The wind howled. Copper had stood on trembling legs, taken 3 painful steps, and collapsed into the shelter. Margaret had tucked the blankets around him, and for the first time in 7 years, Copper had slept deeply. When she'd checked on him at dawn, he'd been watching the street through the shelter opening, still keeping his vigil, but accepting her help. Mrs. Chen, the bakery owner, told Margaret the whole story over coffee. Eleanor Hartley, the heart attack, the niece who'd tried and failed, the 7 years of stubborn, unshakable love. "She's gone," Margaret had said. "He knows she's gone, doesn't he?" "I think he knows, but I don't think he cares. Dogs don't love with conditions, they just love." Margaret had driven to the cemetery that afternoon. Eleanor's grave was simple. Fresh flowers sat in the holder. Mrs. Chen, still visiting after all these years. Eleanor Hartley, 1944 to 2016. Beloved wife, aunt, friend, she made everyone feel seen. Margaret had knelt in the frost-hard grass. "I have your dog," she'd whispered to the headstone. God, Eleanor, he's so loyal it's killing him, but I think I can help. I think I can convince him that it's okay to keep living. That loving you doesn't mean stopping everything else." The wind had rustled through the bare trees. Margaret had felt, or imagined, a sense of permission settling over her. Margaret made Copper her project. Every morning, she'd move her routine a little closer to his fence. Eventually, she was sitting beside him. She'd narrate her life, the Navy cabinets, which looked beautiful, her daughter's pregnancy announcement, her son's new job, the book club she'd joined. Copper would listen, his breathing steady, his amber eyes occasionally meeting hers. One December morning, she'd reached out slowly, so slowly, and touched his head. He hadn't pulled away. Her hand had trembled as she scratched behind his ear. And Copper, 7 years, 2 months, and 18 days into his vigil, had closed his eyes and leaned into her touch. Margaret had sobbed. "It's okay," she'd whispered. "You can let someone love you again. It doesn't mean you're forgetting her." Christmas Eve, Margaret had brought him a present, a new collar, soft and fleece-lined, with a tag that read, "Copper. If found, call Margaret, 5550147. She'd fastened it gently around his neck. "There. Now everyone knows you're not alone." That afternoon, she'd done something risky. She'd opened her front door and said, "Copper, come inside, just for a little while. You can see the street from the window." He'd looked at the door, at her, at his post by the fence. "I know it's scary, but it's warm, and there's a couch that's very comfortable. And I made pot roast." Copper had stood, taken one step toward the porch, then another and another, until he'd crossed the threshold into Margaret's home. The first time he'd been inside a house since Eleanor died. Margaret had led him to the living room window that faced the street. "See, you can still watch. You're still keeping your promise." Copper had settled on the rug by the window, his vigil continuing from a new vantage point. Margaret had sat beside him and cried into his fur. January brought a new routine. Copper spent mornings by the fence, his post, his duty. But afternoons, he'd come inside, let Margaret feed him properly, sleep on the dog bed she'd bought, accept baths and vet care and the warmth of being loved. He began putting on weight. His limp improved with pain medication. The cloudiness in his eye couldn't be fixed. but Dr. Patel said he was healthier than he'd been in years. "You saved him," Dr. Patel told Margaret. "No," Margaret said, watching Copper doze by the fireplace. "He saved me because she'd stopped waiting too. Stopped waiting for her ex-husband to validate her worth. Stopped waiting for her children to need her. Stopped waiting for her life to start again. She'd started living, painting, joining committees, making friends. All because a dog had taught her that loyalty and healing weren't mutually exclusive." Spring came. On a soft April morning, 7 years, 6 months, and 4 days since Eleanor's death, Margaret had asked Copper a question. "Want to go for a walk? To her spot? To say goodbye properly?" They'd driven to the cemetery together. Copper had walked slowly to Eleanor's grave and laid down on the grass beside it, his chin on his paws. The same pose he'd held for 7 years. Margaret had placed fresh lilies on the headstone. "He's okay, Eleanor. He's safe. He's loved. You can rest now. He doesn't have to wait anymore." They'd stayed for an hour. When Margaret finally stood to leave, Copper had stood too. And he'd walked away from the grave without looking back. Not because he'd forgotten, but because he'd finally understood. Love doesn't end when someone dies. It just learns to live differently. The old Victorian house on Maple Street looks different now. There's a cheerful yellow front door, window boxes with geraniums, a porch swing where Margaret and Copper sit every evening. Copper still watches the street sometimes, but now he's watching for Margaret to come home. She's teaching art classes at the community center 3 days a week. He waits by the window, and when her car turns the corner, his tail wags, genuinely happy, not desperately hopeful. The town still talks about him, but now the story has a different ending. "See that dog?" Mrs. Chen tells new customers at the bakery. "He waited 7 years for love to come back. And it did, just not in the way he expected." Sophie Henderson, now in high school, volunteers at the animal shelter and tells Copper's story to every potential adopter who says they want a young, easy dog. "The best ones," she says, "are the ones who know how to be loyal, who've lived and hurt and still choose to love again." On sunny mornings, Margaret and Copper walk to the cemetery together. She brings flowers. He sniffs the grass. They sit quietly for a while. "Thank you," Margaret always whispers to Eleanor's headstone, "for raising a dog who understands what it means to love without conditions." And then they walk home, together, because Copper finally understands what Eleanor knew all along. Staying doesn't mean staying still. Love doesn't mean waiting forever. Sometimes the greatest act of loyalty is learning when to let someone new in. 7 years he waited, not for her to return, but for someone to understand that a heart that waits that long deserves to be loved that deeply in return.